The Voron Collective had never lost a war. Not once. Not in 380 years of expansion across 19 star systems. They had a perfect record, and they knew it, and more importantly, every other civilization in the galaxy knew it too. That reputation was, in many ways, their most powerful weapon. By the time the Voron fleet showed up anywhere, the target had usually already done the math and decided that fighting back was not a serious option. It made things very efficient. The ultimatum they sent to the Terran sovereignty was not unusual by their standards. It was, in fact, one of the more generous ones they had issued in recent decades. The language was clear and the demands were straightforward. Dissolve the 3 outer colony clusters in the Kepler Fringe. Transfer resource extraction rights for the neutronite deposits in sectors 7 through 12 and accept a Voron administrative presence on 2 of the frontier worlds to oversee the transition. In exchange, the Terran sovereignty would receive formal recognition as a protected civilization under Voron oversight, which meant nobody else would bother them either. It was, the Voron delegate privately felt, almost a favor. He had delivered it through the standard diplomatic channels, filed appropriate paperwork with the Galactic Senate, and then sat down across from the Terran envoy in one of the Senate's smaller meeting rooms to wait for the response. These things usually took a few days, sometimes a week. The other side needed time to consult with their leadership, run their own numbers, and arrive at the conclusion that was already obvious before they started. Ambassador Dana Cole had not taken a few days. She had read the document at the table, right there in front of him. He watched her go through it, page by page. She did not rush, but she did not linger either. She read it the way someone reads something they've been expecting, not with surprise, just with attention. When she finished the last page, she set it flat on the table and sat quietly for a moment. Then she folded it in half, picked it up, and slid it back across the table to him. The Voron delegate looked down at the folded document in front of him, then back up at her. "You have made a mistake," she said. Her voice was calm, not angry, not dramatic, not the voice of someone making a threat. Just a flat, even statement, the way you might tell someone they had taken a wrong turn. The delegate waited for more, some kind of counteroffer, a request for negotiation, a list of concerns, something. Dana Cole said nothing else. She gathered her things, stood up, and left the room. The delegate sat there for a moment, looking at the folded ultimatum on the table in front of him. Then he picked it up, smoothed it out, and wrote in his report that the Terran sovereignty had declined to engage seriously with the proposal, and that he recommended proceeding to the next phase. The occupation fleet, 8,000 warships, a force that had ended the resistance of 4 civilizations in the last 60 years, departed from Voron space 3 days later. It was not assembled in a hurry. It had already been assembled, sitting ready, because the Voron did not send ultimatums without having the fleet packed and waiting. That was just good practice. Dana Cole watched them go from the observation deck of the Galactic Senate building. She stood at the window with her hands in her jacket pockets and watched the long-range display, track the fleet as it moved out of Voron space and onto the heading for Terran territory. One of her aides stood beside her and did not say anything for a while. Then the aide asked if she wanted to start the emergency briefings. Dana thought about it for a second. "No," she said. "Let Colonel Reed know the timeline has started. He'll handle the rest." She took one more look at the display, then turned and walked back toward her office. Behind her, 8,000 Voron warships moved through the dark toward human space. Nobody on the Terran side looked worried. That should have been the first sign. General Carl Webb had done this 4 times before, for different civilizations, for different star systems. The details changed, but the pattern never did. You arrived with enough ships to make the math undeniable. You held position in orbit, and you waited. Within a few hours, sometimes less, the broadcast would start. Emergency government sessions going public. Civil defense announcements. Evacuation orders for populations near military installations. The kind of organized panic that a society produces when it suddenly realizes that the thing it had hoped would not happen is actually happening right now. It was not pleasant to watch, but it was predictable, and predictable meant manageable. Carl stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the first human colony world fill the main display as the fleet settled into orbit. It was a decent-sized world, greenish-blue, Thick cloud cover over the northern continent. A scatter of city lights visible on the night side. Population sensors put it at about 40 million people. Not a small settlement. A real colony, established and developed, with infrastructure and industry, and all the things that meant people had been living there for generations. He waited for the broadcast to start. Nothing came. He checked the communications array. It was working fine, picking up plenty of local traffic from the surface, civilian channels, commercial signals, the ordinary background noise of a functioning colony going about its day. People were down there. The population sensors confirmed it. 40 million people and 8,000 warships had just parked above their heads, and emergency channels were completely silent. Carl watched the display for a while longer. Still nothing. No defensive fleet rising to meet them. No signal to the Galactic Senate requesting emergency intervention. No government broadcast telling the population to remain calm. Not even the low-level military chatter that you always picked up when a defending force was scrambling to respond. Just the ordinary noise of a normal day on a colony world that apparently had not noticed or did not care that an occupation fleet was sitting in its sky. He turned to his sensor officer and told him to run a full deep surface scan. Standard procedure before any ground operation. You want to know what was down there before you committed to anything. The scan took about 20 minutes. When the results came back, the sensor officer stared at his screen for a moment without saying anything. Carl noticed the silence and walked over. The scan was reading the colony's subsurface geology in layers, the way these scans always did, working down from the surface crust through the rock beneath. The top layers looked normal. Soil, bedrock, the kind of deep foundation you expected on a settled world. Then, about 300 meters down, things stopped making sense. Hollow sections. Large ones. Not natural cave systems. The geometry was too regular, the edges too clean. These were constructed spaces, deliberately carved out of rock, running in connected tunnels that branched and merged across hundreds of kilometers of subsurface territory. And the chambers themselves were enormous. The scan was flagging some of them as larger than anything Carl had seen in any underground military installation in his career, larger than most surface cities he had visited. He looked at the depth readings. Some of these structures went down over a kilometer. "Run it again," he said. The sensor officer ran it again. Same results. Carl straightened up and looked at the main display, at the quiet green and blue world hanging there in space, looking completely ordinary from the outside. "Scan the next colony," he said. They moved the fleet to the second human world on their list. Ran the same scan. The results came back with the same impossible subsurface readings. Different layout, different depth, but the same basic picture. Vast constructed spaces buried deep beneath the surface that showed nothing unusual from above. Third colony. Same thing. Fourth. Same. Carl went back to the command chair and sat down and looked at nothing in particular for a while. He was running the timeline in his head. These structures were not small. They were not rushed. The sheer volume of rock that would have had to be moved, the engineering involved, the resources required to build on this scale across multiple worlds simultaneously. You did not do that in a few years. You did not do that in a few decades. This had been going on for a very long time. And in all the years that the Vorin Collective had been watching humanity, filing intelligence reports, updating threat assessments, deciding that the Terran sovereignty was a second-tier civilization with a modest military and no serious capacity for large-scale conflict. In all that time, nobody had looked under the surface. Nobody had thought to. Carl sat quietly on his bridge while 8,000 warships held position above a world that was apparently completely unbothered by their presence. Whatever was down there had been built for exactly this kind of moment, and nobody outside humanity had known it existed. The Kethran Union hit fast and hit hard. 2 human colonies, gone in a single campaign that lasted less than 3 weeks. 17 million people displaced. Infrastructure that had taken 40 years to build reduced to rubble in days. The Terran sovereignty had scrambled everything it had. Every patrol ship, every defensive platform, every armed vessel that could reach the area in time. And it had not been enough. Not even close. The Kethran fleet had been larger, better equipped, and more experienced, and the outcome had never really been in doubt. The war ended with a settlement that was, diplomatically speaking, described as a negotiated peace. Everyone understood what it actually was. General Frank Doyle had been on the ground during the Second Colony's fall. He was not a man given to dramatic statements or emotional speeches. His career record described him as methodical, patient, and exceptionally good at logistics. Not the kind of officer who ended up in history books, but the kind who kept large, complicated operations running smoothly over long periods of time. He had spent 30 years moving ships and supplies and personnel around human space with the quiet efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed solving large organizational problems. He had watched the Catherine fleet work, and he had thought about it the entire journey home. 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, he stood before the Terran War Council in a plain meeting room on Luna Station with a single document in his hand and made his case. He did not talk about better weapons. Humanity's weapons were fine. They were not behind anyone technologically in any meaningful way. He did not talk about tactics or training or the quality of Terran officers, all of which were perfectly adequate. He did not talk about alliances or diplomacy or any of the things that the Council had already been discussing for weeks. He talked about numbers. The problem, he said, was not that humanity could not fight. The problem was that any civilization considering a war with humanity could look at the available information, do a straightforward calculation, and arrive at the conclusion that the cost was manageable, that the Terran fleet was a known quantity, that the risk was measurable and therefore acceptable. He said that needed to change. What humanity needed, he argued, was not to be stronger. It needed to be uncountable. It needed to make the calculation so enormous, so completely unreasonable, that no government, no war council, no ambitious general in any civilization anywhere would ever be able to finish the math and still believe that starting a war with humanity made any sense at all. The way to do that, he said, was not to build a big fleet. A big fleet was visible. A visible fleet could be counted, assessed, planned against, and potentially matched by a civilization with enough resources and motivation. No, what he was proposing was different. Shipyards, thousands of them, built quietly over decades in places nobody would think to look, inside the upper atmosphere layers of uninhabited gas giants where the pressure and the storms made scanning difficult, buried in the rock of moons with no strategic value, and no reason for anyone to survey them carefully, sitting dark and cold in the empty stretches between star systems, running on minimal power, producing ships at a steady rate, and storing them in the dark until they were needed. The ships those yards produced would not appear on any official record. The funding would move through infrastructure budgets and long-term development contracts and planetary geology survey programs, the kind of line items that junior analysts filed away without reading and senior officials approved without questioning, because they were boring and because the numbers were spread thin enough that no single entry ever looked unusual. The official Terran fleet size on every galactic database, every Senate filing, every intelligence report from every civilization that bothered to track such things would remain exactly where it was, a modest number, a respectable but unremarkable force for a mid-sized civilization. The real number would never be written down anywhere the outside world could read. The War Council approved the proposal the same day. No press release, no Senate filing, no public record of any kind. The meeting notes were classified at a level that fewer than 40 people in the sovereignty could access, and that number was reviewed and reduced every decade. The work began the following year. It continued for 200 years. Administrations changed. Council members retired and were replaced. The officers who oversaw the program handed it to the next generation and the generation after that, each one inheriting a project that was already larger than the one before them and making it larger still. The technology improved. The yards got faster. The storage systems got better. The coordination network that linked thousands of hidden facilities across human space got quietly upgraded every 15 years to make sure that when the moment came, everything could be activated and move within hours rather than days. Nobody outside a very small, very carefully selected group ever knew the full picture. Most people inside the sovereignty did not know either. They knew their piece of it. A yard supervisor on a gas giant installation knew how many ships his facility produced each year and where they were stored and who to contact if something went wrong. He did not know how many other facilities existed or what the total numbers looked like. That information lived in one office on Luna Station, updated quarterly, never networked, never transmitted, read by 4 people and reviewed by 2. 200 years of quiet, unglamorous, deeply boring work. And when General Carl Webb ordered his fleet into orbit above the first human colony world and found nothing but silence and strange subsurface readings, the number that nobody outside humanity had ever seen was already moving. Shipyard by shipyard, system by system, everything activating at once, on a signal that had been prepared and waiting for exactly this kind of moment. The official record said 4,000 Terran Warships. The real number was something else entirely. Carl Webb was a practical man. He had not gotten to the rank of general by being reckless or emotional or by letting his ego make decisions that his fleet would have to live with afterward. He was careful, methodical, and he had a talent for cutting through complicated situations and finding the straightforward path forward. That practical nature was, in his own estimation, his greatest professional strength. So after 2 days of orbiting human colony worlds and finding nothing but silence and impossible subsurface readings, he made a practical decision. Whatever was underground on these planets was clearly not coming up to meet him. The colony populations were not panicking. No defensive fleet had appeared. The situation on the surface, as far as he could tell from orbit, was completely normal. People go to work, civilian traffic moving between settlements, the ordinary rhythm of a functioning society that had apparently decided the best response to an occupation fleet overhead was to simply ignore it. He could not wait forever. The fleet had a timeline. The Voran collective expected results. He sat down at his desk and began drafting the formal surrender demand. It was a standard document, the kind his office had templates for, requiring colonial government to acknowledge Voran authority, begin the administrative transfer process, and confirm that no resistance would be offered to landing parties. He had filled out versions of this form before. It was not complicated work. He was about halfway through it when his communications officer spoke up. "General, incoming broadcast. It is not from the surface." Carl looked up from his desk. "Origin." The officer checked his panel, looked up with an expression Carl could not quite read. "It appears to be from inside the system. Sir, multiple origin points. We are still trying to get precise fix." Carl pushed the document aside and walked back to the main bridge. The broadcast was already on the primary screen. A man, human, clearly, older, gray hair cut close, sitting in what looked like the command chair of a warship bridge. His uniform was plain, and he wore no decorations that Carl could see. He had the kind of face that had probably been unremarkable 20 years ago and had settled, with age, into something that was very difficult to read, calm in a way that was not performed, the calm of someone who had nothing to be nervous about. His name tag said Reeves. General Webb, the man, said, and his voice was even and unhurried. "My name is Admiral Tom Reeves, Terran Sovereignty Combined Fleet. I will keep this brief because I don't think either of us needs this to take longer than necessary." He looked directly at the camera with the straightforward attention of someone who is used to being listened to. "You have 60 minutes to begin full withdrawal from Terran space. All vessels, every ship, back across the border, immediately. That is the only thing I am asking you to do." He paused. "Just 1 second, maybe less. Before you make a decision," Tom said, "look up." Carl turned to his sensor display. The first jump signature appeared at the edge of the system, a ship dropping out of faster-than-light travel, its drive signature flaring briefly on the sensors before settling into the background. Then another one, then 3 more, at different points around the system's perimeter, then a dozen simultaneously, spread across a wide arc on the far side of the colony world. Carl watched the display and said nothing. The signatures kept coming. They were not appearing randomly. Each ship that dropped into the system moved immediately to a precise position and held there, slotting into a formation that was clearly predetermined, clearly mapped out in advance, the way you position pieces when you plan the arrangement long before the game begins. Sector by sector, position by position, the formation was filling in around the entire system. His sensor officer was running the count on a secondary screen. Carl could see the numbers climbing from the corner of his eye. He did not look directly at them for a while. He kept watching the main display instead, watching jump signature after jump signature bloom and fade across the sensor field. Each one another ship settling into its assigned place in the dark. At some point, his sensor officer stopped updating the count out loud. Carl glanced over. The officer was just staring at his screen. Not pale exactly, but very still, the way a person goes still when their mind is processing something that does not fit into any framework they have for understanding the world. Carl looked at the number on the secondary screen. He looked at it for a long time. The 60 minutes passed. He was not sure exactly when, because at some point he had stopped watching clock and had just been standing there watching the display while the formation continued to fill in around him, ship after ship after ship appearing out of the dark and taking its place in the structure, so large it covered the entire system from one edge to the other. 500,000 Terran warships, sitting still, running quiet, no targeting locks, no aggressive positioning, just present, in numbers that made his 8,000 ships look like a rounding error, waiting with the patient silence of something that has been waiting for a very long time and is in absolutely no hurry now that the moment has finally arrived. Tom Reeves had not sent a follow-up message. He did not need to. Carl Webb went back to his desk. He did not finish the surrendered demand document. He opened a different form instead, the standard withdrawal notification, the one that informed all vessels in the fleet to reverse course and return to home space. He filled it out carefully, the way he did everything methodically and without rushing. He authorized it, sent it fleet-wide. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his office for a moment. 8,000 ships turned around and began the journey home. Behind them, 500,000 Terran warships held their positions and watched them go, not pursuing, not threatening, simply present. The way a wall is present, not aggressive, not angry, just completely and absolutely immovable. Carl Webb did not send a single shot. There was nothing practical about doing otherwise. The Voran fleet went home. It took 12 days. 12 days of 8,000 warships retracing the route they had come on, moving back through the border and into Voran space. And not a single Terran vessel followed them or harassed them or made the journey any harder than it needed to be. The humans simply watched them go. That was all. And somehow that was worse than being chased, because being chased would have felt like something Carl Webb understood. Being watched, patiently and silently, by 500,000 ships that could have ended the entire fleet in an afternoon, but chose not to, that felt like something else. Something he did not have a word for. He filed his report. When he got home, it was the most difficult document he had ever written. 6 weeks after the fleet crossed back into Voran space, Ambassador Dana Cole stood before the full Galactic Senate in the main chamber and gave a speech that lasted 9 minutes. She did not use notes. She stood at the podium in her plain, dark uniform and spoke in the same calm, even tone she used for everything, the tone that people who worked with her for years recognized as simply the way she talked, not a performance, not a diplomatic affectation, just how she communicated when she had something to say and wanted it understood clearly. She said that humanity was a peaceful civilization, that they had always been a peaceful civilization, that the Terran sovereignty had no interest in conquest, no territorial ambitions, no designs on anyone else's planets or resources or shipping lanes or anything else. They were content with their space and their worlds and the lives their people lived there. She said that they understood the galaxy was a complicated place, that other civilizations had interests and pressures and internal politics that sometimes pushed them toward decisions that were not, in the long run, good decisions. She said humanity did not hold that against anyone particularly. She said that they had made a choice a long time ago to be a peaceful civilization in a way that was actually sustainable, not peaceful because they were weak, not peaceful because they were isolated or lucky or protected by powerful friends, peaceful because they had done the work over a very long time to make sure that peace was genuinely the only rational option anyone looking at them from the outside would ever seriously land on. Then she said thank you, gathered her things, and sat down. 9 minutes. No dramatics. No list of demands. No thinly veiled threats dressed up in diplomatic language. Just a plain, clear statement of fact delivered by a woman who did not appear to feel that it required any elaboration. The chamber was quiet for a moment after she sat down. Then the session continued. Because Senate sessions always continue, but the quality of the silence before it did was different from usual. The kind of silence that falls on a room full of experienced people is all doing the same calculation at the same time and all arriving at the same answer. Down a corridor off the main Senate floor, past 2 sets of security doors, and through a small administrative wing that most delegates never had reason to visit, there was a row of analyst offices. Small rooms, functional, the kind of space that exists in every large bureaucracy for the people who do the background work that the people in the main chamber rely on without thinking about. One of those offices had a light on. A Voran intelligence analyst sat alone at his desk with a screen full of revised estimate files and a cup of something hot that had gone cold an hour ago because he had forgotten to drink it. His name was Dovin. He was 43 years old, and he had been studying the Terran sovereignty for his entire professional career. Nearly 2 decades of reports and assessments and threat evaluations that had gone up the chain, been reviewed by senior analysts, been incorporated into Voran strategic planning at the highest levels. He had filed hundreds of documents about humanity. Hundreds. Each one careful, thorough, based on the best available data, reviewed and approved and stamped and distributed to people who made real decisions based on what they said. Every single one of them had been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in minor details or peripheral assessments. Wrong in the fundamental conclusion, the one that everything else rested on, that the Terran sovereignty was a manageable civilization, a mid-tier power, a modest military presence with no serious capacity to project force beyond its immediate borders. The kind of species that a determined and well-equipped adversary could push around without expecting serious consequences. He sat with that for a while. The files on his screen showed the revised numbers, the actual numbers, the things that had been sitting in the dark for 200 years, while he and every analyst before him had been confidently filing reports about a 4,000-ship fleet and a civilization that had never shown any signs of being particularly dangerous. He looked at those numbers and thought about all the decisions that had been made on the basis of his work. All the planning sessions, all the strategy meetings where someone had pulled up a Voran intelligence assessment of humanity and used it as a foundation for an argument. All of it built on information that humanity had known was wrong. That was the part he kept coming back to, not the ships. The ships were shocking. Yes, the sheer scale of what had been hidden for 2 centuries was genuinely staggering, but ships could be explained. Ships were just resources and time and organizational will, and humanity had clearly had all 3 in abundance. What he could not stop thinking about was the choice. For 200 years, the Terran sovereignty had watched the outside galaxy build its understanding of them on incorrect foundations. They had watched species after species file reports and run assessments and make strategic calculations based on a picture of humanity that was fundamentally completely wrong. They had watched the Voran collective spend years looking at those assessments and deciding that the Terran frontier worlds were a reasonable target. And they had never said a word, never corrected the record, never let anything slip, never allowed any piece of the real picture to surface in any intelligence channel anywhere. They had maintained the gap between what the galaxy believed and what was actually true across generations of leadership, across centuries of political change, with a discipline and a patience that Dovin could not fully wrap his mind around even now that he knew it had been done. They had let the galaxy believe what it wanted to believe, and they had waited, not with anger, not with arrogance, just with the quiet, settled confidence of a civilization that had done its work, knew its work was good, and was content to let the rest of the universe catch up whenever it was ready. Dovin sat in his small office for a long time after Dana Cole's speech ended. He was not sure what he was feeling exactly. Something that was not quite fear and not quite respect, but lived somewhere in the territory between the two. He thought about the 4 words she had said to the Voran delegate 6 weeks ago, before any of this had happened, before a single ship had moved. "You have made a mistake." She had known then. She had known exactly what was coming, exactly what was waiting, exactly how it would end. She had said 4 words and walked out of the room, because 4 words were all that was necessary, and she had better things to do with her morning. Dovin closed the files on his screen. He picked up his cold drink, looked at it, and set it back down. Outside in the main chamber the Senate session was continuing, moving on to other business, other disputes, other civilizations with other problems. The galaxy was carrying on the way it always did. But something had changed in it today. Something quiet and permanent. Every civilization in that chamber had done the same math and arrived at the same place. And the place they had arrived at was this. Humanity had been there the whole time, patient and prepared and completely invisible, and nobody had known. Nobody had known because humanity had not wanted them to know. And that, more than the ships, more than the underground chambers, more than any specific weapon or system or capability, was a thing that would stay with every delegate, every analyst, every strategic planner, and every civilization represented in that building for the rest of their careers. You could count ships. You could assess weapons. You could measure a fleet and calculate what it could do. You could not measure patience like that. You could not plan against a civilization that had been preparing for you before you had decided to come. The galaxy adjusted, quietly, without announcements, without anyone admitting directly that anything had changed. Borders that had been drifting gradually in one direction stopped drifting. Expansion plans that had included certain regions were revised. Intelligence budgets across a dozen civilizations were quietly increased, not because anyone expected to find anything new, but because everyone was now uncomfortably aware of what happened when you stopped looking carefully. Dana Cole went back to her office after the speech and started on the afternoon's paperwork. She had a lot to get through.